starting with Elijah or Elia, we are starting talking about now the great holy prophets. And this is a new epoch for a new era for Israel, when the holy prophets become really the dominant figures. We had Joshua as a general, and then we had the judges of Israel, who were supposed to make sure that things were done in a fair and just manner, and also, in a way, they were the teachers for Israel. Something like bishops in the church. And now we go into really the great holy prophets. You know, we had some of the prophets mentioned before this, but Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, or Isaiah, and all of the great prophets that followed. There's a kind of a shift or something different being taught now. Israel starts off like a child, and they have some instructions from God, but they've added a lot of things to it. Now the holy prophets are coming to tell Israel, look, it's not only about not worshiping idols like statues or something. There are other kinds of idolatry too. And one of the biggest idolatries, the holy prophets are going to tell us, one of the biggest idolatries is greed. So you have moral idolatry also, not just physical idolatry like Baal and Molech and the statues around. That part of the problem is the way Israel has begun to react toward widows, orphans, strangers, and these other things. And when Elijah himself, or Elias, heals a woman who's not an Israelite, he heals her son, and that works this miracle in her household. And Jesus is going to refer to that later. There were many widows in Israel, but he didn't go to any of them. He went to a widow who was not of Israel, the prophet. Because he's really trying to show us that the prophets are like holy apostles, that the revelation of God is not just for you people, it's for everybody. Don't try to make it into just tribal, that God is for everybody. And now the prophets are going to start teaching a higher level, because Israel is supposed to be growing up into a nation. And when Elijah comes to the end, or Elias, comes toward the end of his time, God instructs him to select somebody to succeed him. Well, God really chooses somebody for him. So Elias, has been hiding out in the forest, hiding out in the wilderness, really, not a forest, from Jezebel and her followers, because he's destroyed the priests of the false god. And God tells him to come back and go, and you're going to find a wealthy farmer, the son of a wealthy farmer. Elijah, we know that Elisha was wealthy because he didn't have only 2 oxen to pull his plow, he had 12 oxen. So somebody with more than 2 oxen is fairly well-to-do. And he's plowing in the field, and Elijah comes along and puts his mantle on his shoulders and tells him, well, come on, you're going to be my student and my replacement. It's rather like Jesus coming to the Sea of Galilee and saying to Peter and the others, follow me, and they leave their nets and their boats and their father and they follow him. But Elisha does the same thing now with Elijah, with Elias. And he's got to carry on, of course, the testimony against Ahab and Jezebel, against this idolatry of Baal that's come into the country. But it's not just this particular kind of idolatry, the worship of Baal and Molech, where you had human sacrifices. So we have to look a little bit at what are the prophets, really. Sometimes when we talk about prophets, or you see YouTube about modern-day would-be prophets, there are people who say they can foretell the future. But that's not what prophecy is about in the Bible. Prophecy is about saying what the people of God are doing wrong, how their behavior is wrong, how the way they're following the faith is wrong. In this case, to tell them that, well, you worship these idols and you lose God's grace and something bad's going to happen to you. But also, we're going to start reading throughout all of these Amos, Obadiah, Hosea, and Micah, Malachi. All of them are complaining about how Israel treat other people. So one thing we're going to find out from the holy prophets now is the way you treat other people is extremely important in God's revelation. And charitableness and empathy. Now, I think everybody knows what empathy is. When we talk about co-suffering love, you have to have empathy. And empathy means that you can feel, you see another person suffering and you see it as suffering, not as something that you can judge or condemn. But in other people's passions or sins, you see yourself also. And so when you try to help somebody who's in a difficult moral situation even, as long as you can see yourself in that person, you can help them. But if you take the attitude that you're higher than them morally, you can't. You can just sort of condemn them or look down on them or have pity, but you can't have real empathy or real feeling for them. And you could say, well, I never did anything like that. Well, no, but you did the same thing, only a different species. You know, we do just a different species of the same thing, and then we think we didn't do the same thing. I mean, you never murdered anybody, but you really thought of somebody you would like to shove them down the stairs so they break their neck or something. It's, you know, it's the same thing. That's why Jesus said if you did it in your mind, you did it. And when the Holy Fathers were developing what we call the prayer regarding the mind, used the Jesus prayer regarding the mind. And the Desert Fathers and Mothers always used this. And the way they described it is amazing because it's precisely what actually happens from a neurobiological point of view. And it's like a thought comes into your mind, and as the fathers say, well, this is no sin, there's nothing wrong with it. It just comes into your mind and you do some action without thinking. Then the same thought begins to travel through, you know, to the prefrontal lobe and the neocortex, and then up to the frontal lobe. And what happens at each stage of it, you identify the thought or the stimulus, and then you sort of analyze it, and then you decide whether it's negative or positive, and then you either reject it or allow it to hang around in your mind, and it moves up to the front part, and when you start taking pleasure in the thought, that's when it becomes a sin. So that's why Jesus Christ didn't say, if you admire a woman in your mind, it's sin, but if you commit adultery with her in your mind, it's the same as if you committed adultery in reality. That is, if you start taking pleasure in these thoughts and entertaining them. So if you think, you know, I wish my 12th grade teacher would slip on a banana peel and break her neck. It's kind of like, and you take pleasure in the thought, it's all the same as if you pushed her down the stairs herself. I mean, morally. So we think about morality as only something you do externally, but morality takes place in the mind and the heart in it. And so this is why the prophets are all warning, you know, remember what the prophet says, this is a fast that's well-pleasing to God. Not just that you don't eat certain food, but that you try to lift the heavy burden from those who are oppressed, that you set free those who are in bondage, that you concern yourself with those who have nothing to eat or nothing to wear. This is the kind of fast that's pleasing to God. And otherwise, we fast for ourselves, but we don't think about anybody else. And so our fast is wasted if we can't think about other people. That's what the prophet's saying. So it's not just saying foretelling the future. You know, we have so many would-be prophets today telling us when the end of the world is going to come, even the time of day when it's going to happen. And year after year we hear that, well, the second coming is going to take place on May the 23rd. You know, just in favor of Queen Victoria's birthday, I suppose. But there's always something. November, September, I think last year the world was going to end in September. And you had a bunch of these so-called prophets telling us when it was going to come to an end. Of course, nothing like that ever happens, but that's not what prophecy is about anyway. Uh, the holy prophets are the ones who censured kings and rulers and the wealthy as well as everyone else. You know, as the prophets Amos, Obadiah, Hosea, they're complaining that you sell the peasants for a pair of sandals. You trample the poor into the dust. You're the upper 10% and the lower 90% are just under your feet. So this is what prophets are actually doing, is telling us how to live our lives actually according to God's plan. And suddenly you realize that, wait a minute, they're telling us how God wants us to live, and they're telling us to be charitable, to be loving, to be kind, to be caring, to have empathy for other human beings. And this is what the prophets are telling us, all of them, about it. So Elisha is not just there, not foretelling the future, you know, that the Assyrian kingdom is going to come and conquer Israel because they won't give up the idolatry, but also trying to tell people how they should worship and how they should, in a general sense, how they should live their lives. The king shouldn't be having forced labor from his own subjects. He shouldn't be overtaxing people. You shouldn't be seeing what you could get out of somebody else, and all of that. So this is trying to balance our lives and put our lives into balance. And Prophet Elisha, among them, one of the greatest of the prophets, he even shows us how, through the relics of Prophet Elias, he raised somebody from the dead. But we need to think about what prophecy actually means, because so many people are deluded and led astray by these false prophets who are telling the future. And, you know, we have them in Russia, I'm sure in Romania as well. There are people who put a glass of water on your head and drop wax into it, and then they read the shape of the wax to tell the future for you. And these people are very popular. And in Russia, they say that there's one of these fortune tellers. There's one for every 3 priests in the country that people go to or consult.
Oh,
And, yeah.
that's a lot.
Well, you know, it's so easy to lead people astray in a way. I remember Metropolitan Anthony Kropivitsky at the beginning of the 20th century, last century. He said, in our epoch, anybody who's not embarrassed or ashamed can pass himself off as God and get a following. Well, as you think of you know, Ron Hubbard, who started Scientology and then somewhere along the line decided that he was God. And he still has followers. And it's so ludicrous and ridiculous. So when, you know, people wonder, how can Antichrist delude everybody? So, just look around. It's not difficult at all to delude people. I mean, every time we have an election, we got a bunch of people running around deluding us with all the speeches. And I remember quoting a phrase once in President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address at the end of the Civil War in America. He said, we're testing whether a nation so, so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So I thought, well, in our day, it's a nation so deceived and so medicated, not conceived and dedicated, can it long endure. And talking about drugs a little bit earlier this evening, because of a young lady who's literally going to die because of the drugs she used. And it's so easy to get people involved in all of these delusions. So it's not difficult for Satan to delude us. It's not difficult for the Antichrist to delude people and claim that he's God and people will follow him. You know, we're kind of open to it. And every time we respond to one of these false prophets who say they're foretelling the future, then we become more deluded and more deceived. Unfortunately, they're doing it in the name of Christianity. Because they're mostly evangelical Protestants. And they're setting the date for the end of the world and the second coming of Christ, which Christ warned us not to bother thinking about it because, you know, the end of the world can come for any one of us any moment. So we don't. But this is what's happening in the world around us, because when we look at the Old Testament prophets, and that's why I wanted to speak about it a little bit, they're criticizing society and culture. and they're criticizing with a special power to their speech. And of course, every one of them, the leaders of the nation, are going to try to kill them. Remember, Prophet Jeremy was prophesying before, in Judah, before the Babylonian Empire came and conquered the city. And so the first, they hanged him up in a cage in the sun, and just hanging by a rope in a wicker cage. Then they threw him into a well and threw him into prison and tortured him in various ways, because they knew he was telling the truth. That's the problem. They knew he was telling the truth about them. That's why they were angry. If he'd been just saying falsehoods about them, they could have dismissed him or done something else, driven him out. But because he was telling the truth, they had special punishments for him. And all of the prophets endured and suffered death. So Zachary, Prophet Zachary, whose book is, they call it the Minor Prophets because the book is short. Remember, Zachary was killed in the temple itself because of his prophecies, because they knew he was telling the truth about them. And this is the true meaning of prophecy and what the prophets are all about. We had, in the Orthodox Church, the Russian ones are the more famous, but they existed everywhere, called Fools for Christ. And I think I should give everybody a copy of the little book, God's Fools, because they were prophets in the same way. And in a way, you look at how they were defending the people from the powerful. Nicholas Salas, who was in the city of Pskov, I told you the story before, I'll repeat it though. Nicholas Salas was a fool for Christ. And he lived in the steps of the church came down like this, and there was an arch, and there was a small room there. That's where he lived. And Ivan the Terrible had just invaded Novgorod, and he burned people alive and slid them down the hill into a hole in the ice so they would freeze to death, destroyed the city and killed thousands of people. And he was marching on Pskov. Of course, everybody was terrified. And as he came into the city, everybody tried to placate him. They lined up the street with bread and salt to welcome him. And he came into the city scowling at everyone. And along comes Nicholas Salas riding on a stick horse, a child's stick horse. And he gallops around in a circle around Ivan on his horse. And he says, Vanya, Vanya, don't touch the hair of the heads of these people. And to call him Vanya, that's like saying Little Johnny to Ivan the Terrible. So he rides off, and Ivan's rather upset. And every city had its own Liberty Bell in those days. And the Americans think they invented that, but the cities all had a Liberty Bell, a Betcha Bell. And to take the Liberty Bell away and annex this place to Ivan's growing empire. So he came to take the Liberty Bell away. He went to the cathedral where the bell was in the bell tower, and he went in and ordered them to serve him a moleben for his health. So, they rather served a panikida, but they served him a moleben instead. He was quite furious, and he came out of the church scowling at everyone. And Nicholas Salas, the fool, came out and said, Vanyushka, Vanyushka, come in, come in. So Ivan, he was a little afraid of the fools for Christ because he knew that they had a special connection with God. So he stepped in, and it was Great Lent, Mare Post. So Ivan threw Nicholas threw a slab of raw meat down on the table and says, eat, Vanya, eat. And Ivan drew back and he said, I'm a Christian, I don't eat meat in Lent. And Nicholas the fool said, but you eat the flesh of your subjects and drink their blood during Lent. And Ivan was quite furious. And he said, Vanyushka, flee from this city before you have nothing upon which to ride. And Ivan was furious, and he stormed out. And then at that point, lightning struck his horse. And he said, remember the fool said, flee before you have nothing on which to ride. So he got on the horse behind his adjutant and took his army, and they left the whole city and never touched anyone, never did any destruction or damage. And these people were fools in the same way. And we think, why did they do such strange things? Like, very often they would drag a dead dog through the streets or something like that to to get people's attention. And we remember that when Ezekiel was prophesying, remember Ezekiel got down on his hands and knees, he put a brick in the road, and he started throwing pebbles at it. And he was talking about the siege of Jerusalem, which was going to destroy the city. Dragged all of his belongings on a rope behind him. And I think it was Elisha that ran around naked for a while in the streets because Israel was stripped naked of its spiritual vesture. And so all of them did these rather strange things which got people's attention and prophesied something. But they weren't foretelling the future. They were foretelling, they could tell you that, well, some disaster is going to happen if you don't stop doing what you're doing, because you won't have God's protection and God's grace anymore, because you've turned it away yourself. He didn't turn away from you, you turned away from him. And so when you hear people now foretelling the future, don't pay any attention to them. Criticizing the things that are going wrong in the church, criticizing our extremisms, our fanaticisms, or criticizing, you might have a fool for Christ criticizing Mr. Putin in Russia or something. But this is what prophecy is really about. It's, you know, Ivan the Terrible used to pray all night and repent, and then the next day he would go out and kill a bunch of people so he'd have something to repent for the next night. It's a little bit like Stavrogan in Dostoevsky's The Possessed. He would commit terrible crimes, so attempting to get into touch with his conscience, or so his conscience would bother him. I mean, the novel that Ivan is, Dostoevsky is sort of examining this phenomenon. Ivan repented bitterly for all of the crimes that he did, but then the next day he would go and do them all over again. And Philip, the Metropolitan of Moscow at the time, tried to stand between Ivan and the people and tried to get him to stop the massacres and slaughters. And Ivan had him murdered as well in the prison. But somehow Ivan was afraid of the fools for Christ because there was kind of a spiritual power there. And they were exactly the same as Isaiah, Ezekiel, Elias, and these others. That they're critiquing the ruler, critiquing the ruling class, critiquing the whole country, and critiquing individuals. And that's why they were persecuted so greatly. And Christ remarks how the prophets were persecuted. And really, now when we come to our time, and we listen to would-be prophets like televangelists and things, they say a great deal about external behavior, about something that's tied to politics, it's tied to the nation somehow, particularly in America. It's tied to the American culture and the American state. So it's a kind of a political cult of a kind. And if you listen to the difference between what they're saying and what the holy prophets were saying, it's very striking that the holy prophets were concerned about what you can do for other people, how you can feed, how you can clothe, how you can take care and shelter strangers, how you can make sure that people who are suffering or under heavy weights, how that's lifted from their shoulders. And when you get these modern day speakers, they're talking about what you should not do for people. You know, it's socialist or it's communist if you actually do something to help people on a broad scale. And this is sort of how you can weigh the difference. In any case, I didn't want to go much further. Just, it's like some of the literature that you find in churches when you go. And we talked about this a little bit before. And very few people want to read the Holy Fathers. Even when you have a simplified version of the Holy Fathers. They want to read something magic. They really want to read about something magical or mystical that they believe it, but they don't actually believe it. And the reason I say they don't actually believe it is because it doesn't change anybody's life. You know, you can pick up some of these mystical, magical booklets in a church, and you go home and read them, and then you go and get drunk and beat your wife anyway. Or you do something like that. It doesn't change anybody at all. So we always prefer something that's sensational to something that's true. or something that's real. And this is what the holy prophets were speaking about as well. So, anybody have any questions? I don't want to go on. I really want to talk about the nature of prophecy and what the prophets were doing, and how the false prophets or people who say they're predicting the future are always fake.